Welcome back, dear explorer. Pull the blanket just a little closer tonight. Set down whatever is weighing on your mind, the deadlines, the worries, the little anxieties that buzz like static around the edges of your thoughts. Just for now, let all of that go. Because tonight, we are going somewhere extraordinary. Tonight, the Midnight Explorer takes you to the edge of the sky. To a place where the air itself has a heartbeat. Where clouds descend like curious fingers reaching down toward the earth. Where sound becomes something you feel in your chest before you ever hear it with your ears. Tonight, we are going to talk about tornadoes. And I know what you might be thinking. Tornadoes, isn't that a science lesson? A weather report? A disaster documentary? No. No, not tonight. Tonight, we are going to walk inside the story of the tornado. We are going to sit with the people who first looked up at the swirling sky and wondered what ancient force had awoken. We are going to travel through centuries of human fear, awe, curiosity, and courage. We are going to explore the science, but more than that, we are going to explore what it means to live on a planet so wildly, beautifully alive that it occasionally spins the air itself into a column of fury. Because tornadoes are not just weather events. They are stories. They are chapters in the long, unfinished book of Earth's biography. And every person who has ever stood on a porch and watched a dark green sky turn terrifyingly still, every farmer who has ever looked at a flattened field and whispered a prayer, every scientist who has ever chased a funnel cloud across the Oklahoma plains with instruments strapped to the hood of a truck, every single one of them is a character in this story. And so are you. So settle in, dear explorer. Let the music wrap around you like fog. Let the soft sound of wind and distant thunder carry you away from wherever you are tonight. We are going storm chasing. But gently. Safely. The way you explore the most magnificent things in life, with wonder, with patience, and with time. Long before there were radar systems. Long before there were meteorologists in television studios with animated maps and color-coded threat levels. Long before there were storm shelters, or early warning sirens, or satellite imagery beamed to your phone in real time. There was just the sky. And the sky, on certain days, in certain places, did something that no human being had a complete language for. Imagine, for a moment, that you are a person living 10,000 years ago on the open grasslands of what we now call North America. Your world is enormous and ancient and full of things you do not fully understand. The sun rises and sets like a faithful companion. The stars will overhead in patterns your ancestors have memorized and named. The seasons turn in their reliable rhythms, cold, warm, green, gold, cold again. You understand your world. And then one afternoon, the sky turns the color of a bruise. The air goes perfectly, unnervingly still. The birds disappear. The insects stop their singing. Your animals grow restless, pulling at their tethers, their eyes wide with something older than thought. And then, a sound. Not thunder, exactly. Not wind, exactly. Something deeper than both. A sound like the earth itself is groaning. Like the sky has found a voice. You look to the horizon. And there it is. A column of darkness, hanging between the clouds above and the ground below, spinning, spinning, spinning. It touches down somewhere in the distance, and where it touches, the world disappears into a roaring cloud of dust and debris. It moves with terrible purpose, not randomly, but toward something. Toward you, it seems, though you cannot know for certain. What do you do with that? What story do you tell around the fire that night, if there is a fire left? What name do you give to a force so enormous, so deliberate seeming, so magnificent and so terrifying at once? This is where the story of tornadoes truly begins. Not in a laboratory. Not in a university. Not in any book. It begins in the human heart, standing at the edge of something incomprehensible, searching for meaning. And so, across every culture that has ever lived beneath a tornado-prone sky, meaning was found. Stories were woven. Gods were named. Rituals were performed. Let us begin there. In the oldest stories. The Great Plains of North America. That vast, sweeping corridor of grassland stretching from Texas up through Kansas and Nebraska and into the Dakotas, is, and has always been, one of the most tornado-prone regions on the entire planet. We call it Tornado Alley today, with a kind of casual familiarity that strips away much of its power. But the indigenous peoples who lived on those plains for thousands of years before European settlers arrived. The Comanche, the Lakota, the Osage, the Wichita, the Pawnee, and dozens of other nations, they did not have the luxury of casual familiarity. They had reverence. They had fear. They had stories. Among the Lakota people, the tornado was not simply a weather phenomenon. It was understood as the presence of whirlwind, a powerful spirit figure, unpredictable, neither wholly good nor wholly evil, but deeply powerful. Whirlwind was associated with transformation and disruption. It arrived without announcement and departed, leaving the world changed. You could not bargain with whirlwind. You could not appease it with offerings or prayers in the traditional sense. You could only acknowledge it. Respect it. Move out of its way. There is something profoundly wise in that understanding, even from a purely modern perspective. Because that is, in many ways, the same conclusion that 21st century meteorologists have reached: you cannot stop a tornado. You cannot redirect it. You cannot bargain with it. You can only understand it as well as possible, and move out of its way. Among the Comanche, stories speak of spinning spirits, forces that moved across the land with great speed and power, leaving trails of destruction that marked the boundaries of sacred and profane spaces. The places where tornadoes had touched down were often treated with a kind of solemn respect, not visited casually, not built upon without ceremony. Think about that for a moment. Think about how deeply embedded in the human psyche is the understanding that some forces are simply bigger than us. And how, in the absence of scientific explanation, that understanding takes on spiritual dimensions. This is not primitive thinking. This is human thinking at its most fundamental, the search for meaning in the face of overwhelming natural power. Across the Atlantic, in the ancient cultures of the Mediterranean and the Middle East, whirlwind imagery carried enormous spiritual weight as well. In the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Job, one of the most powerful, most examined passages in all of ancient literature involves God speaking to Job from a whirlwind. The Hebrew word used is esiera, a violent storm, a spinning wind. God does not speak to Job from a gentle breeze. God does not whisper from a clear blue sky. God speaks from the most terrifying, most overwhelming, most incomprehensible force in Job's experience of the natural world. The message embedded in that choice of imagery is significant: I am beyond your understanding. I am beyond your judgment. I am the force that spins the world. In ancient Mesopotamia, in the civilizations of Sumer and Babylon, which represent some of the earliest human urban cultures, there were storm gods whose power was specifically associated with the violent, spiraling winds we would recognize as tornado-like. Enlil, the Sumerian god of wind and air and storms, was among the most powerful of the divine pantheon. He could be nurturing, sending rains that fed the crops, breezes that cooled the summer heat. But he could also be wrathful, sending destructive winds that tore through cities and left devastation in their wake. The Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, describes the primordial goddess Tiamat being defeated by the god Marduk partly through the use of Imholu, the evil wind, a swirling, violent wind that Marduk drives into Tiamat's open mouth, distending her body until it can be split apart to form heaven and earth. Even the creation of the world, in this ancient understanding, involves a violent, spinning wind. There is something deeply poetic about that. Wind. Specifically chaotic, violent, spinning wind, as a force of creation as much as destruction. As the mechanism by which chaos becomes order, by which formlessness becomes form. We will return to that idea later, when we look at the actual science of how tornadoes form. Because the parallels, I promise you, are remarkable. In ancient Greece, the god of the winds was Aeolus, who kept the winds imprisoned in a bag and released them according to divine will. The most destructive winds were personified as the anemoi, divine beings with their own names, personalities, domains. Typhon, from whose name we derive the word typhoon, was a monstrous figure associated with violent, spinning winds. He was the last great monster of Greek mythology, a creature of such terrifying power that even the Olympian gods fled from him in fear. Across the world, in the ancient cultures of East Asia, spinning winds were associated with dragons. Those magnificent, powerful creatures that could bring rain and destruction in equal measure. The dragon tornado, a waterspout observed over a lake or the sea, was seen as a dragon descending from the heavens or ascending from the waters, a bridge between the divine and the earthly. In West Africa, among various Yoruba and Igbo traditions, whirlwinds and dust devils were associated with specific orishas, divine spirits, and with the presence of ancestors moving through the world. A sudden spinning wind was not random chance. It was a message. A presence. Something paying attention. I find myself moved by this. By the sheer universality of it. Across every continent. Across every century. Across wildly different cultures with different languages, different gods, different cosmologies, human beings looked at the spinning, violent wind and found in it something alive. Something intentional. Something greater than themselves. And while the scientific explanation we have today is different from any of these ancient stories, and in many ways, is more wonderful, more intricate, more breathtaking than any of them, I want us to hold on to that original impulse. The impulse of wonder. The impulse that says, this thing is extraordinary, and it deserves my full attention. Because that impulse, that ancient, human, irrepressible impulse toward wonder, is ultimately what gave birth to the science of meteorology. And the science of meteorology, over centuries of patient observation and hard-won understanding, has given us the most remarkable story of all. The earliest written accounts of what we would recognize as tornadoes are fascinating documents, not because they are accurate by modern scientific standards, but because they reveal so vividly how human beings across the ages have tried to wrestle the overwhelming into language. One of the earliest detailed accounts of what appears to be a tornado in historical record comes from ancient China. The Chinese had been carefully observing and recording weather phenomena for thousands of years. Their astronomical and meteorological records are among the oldest and most detailed in the world. And among those records are descriptions of long li, the dragon-twisting wind, that match the characteristics of tornadoes quite remarkably. The spinning motion, the funnel shape, the tremendous destructive power, the narrow path of devastation, all are described in these early records with a level of precision that, even filtered through cultural and linguistic interpretation, speaks to careful, direct observation. In Europe, the earliest detailed written accounts of tornado-like storms begin appearing in medieval chronicles. These documents, written mostly by monks and clerics who kept records of extraordinary events, describe spinning columns of wind that descended from dark clouds, uprooted trees, demolished buildings, and lifted people and animals from the ground. One of the most remarkable early European accounts comes from England. The Worcestershire Chronicle of 1041 describes what appears to be a tornado striking the town of Worcester, a spinning column of wind that arose from a black cloud and tore through the town, destroying buildings and killing several people. The chronicler, struggling to place the event within his theological framework, describes it as a divine punishment, but his physical description of what he observed is, to modern eyes, startlingly accurate. Medieval European thinking about storms in general, and tornado-like events in particular, was deeply intertwined with theology. Natural disasters were read as signs, omens, messages from God. A terrible spinning wind that destroyed a town might be interpreted as divine judgment on that town's wickedness. Or it might be seen as a sign of coming catastrophic events, war, plague, famine. This was not superstition in the dismissive sense. This was people doing exactly what human beings always do, reaching for meaning in the face of the incomprehensible. Using the best tools available to them, which were, in medieval Europe, theological and philosophical tools. To construct a framework that could hold the terrifying weight of what they had witnessed. And interestingly, this interpretive framework was not without utility. The theological response to a tornado, rebuild, care for the injured, mourn the dead, strengthen the community, is not so different from the emergency management response we would recommend today. The mechanism of understanding was different. The practical wisdom embedded in the response was often remarkably sound. In the Americas, European colonists arriving in the 17th and 18th centuries encountered tornadoes in a context very different from their European experience. Europe is not without tornadoes. They do occur across Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Central Europe, but they are generally weaker and less frequent than the massive storms that sweep across North America's interior. Early colonial accounts of North American tornadoes are among the most vivid and dramatic documents from the period. A Massachusetts Bay Colony record from 1643 describes what is almost certainly a tornado striking the region, a sudden gust of wind that uprooted trees, scattered buildings, and moved, in a narrow path, across the landscape, leaving areas on either side relatively undisturbed. This narrow path characteristic, destruction in a ribbon, with untouched land on either side, was already being noted as something distinctive about these events. By the 18th century, as scientific thinking began to reshape European and colonial American intellectual culture, the tornado began to shift, slowly, tentatively, from the domain of theological interpretation toward the domain of natural inquiry. And standing at that crossroads, with his famous kite and his restless, magnificent mind, was a man you know well. Benjamin Franklin is celebrated, rightly, for his work on electricity. His kite experiment in 1752, his identification of lightning as electrical discharge, his invention of the lightning rod, these are among the most iconic moments in the history of science. But Franklin was not merely a student of electricity. He was a student of the sky. Franklin was, in many ways, the first great American meteorologist. And his fascination with storms, winds, and atmospheric phenomena ran throughout his long scientific career. In the autumn of 1755, Franklin was traveling by horseback through Maryland with his son William. They came upon a small whirlwind, what we would likely describe today as a dust devil or a very weak tornado, moving across a field. And Benjamin Franklin did something that tells you everything you need to know about the man. He chased it. He rode his horse at full speed alongside the whirlwind, trying to understand its structure and behavior. He observed it carefully. He noted that it moved with a spinning motion, that it drew up dust and debris from the ground, that it seemed to have a kind of inner column of ascending air surrounded by descending air on the outside. He tried to break it with his whip, striking into the spinning column, and noted that the whirlwind was not disrupted but continued on its path. Later, he wrote about this encounter in letters to friends and colleagues, attempting to construct a scientific explanation for what he had observed. He proposed, remarkably correctly, given the observational tools available to him, that whirlwinds were the result of a column of air heated unevenly, rising rapidly and drawing in surrounding air that then began to spin. Franklin's insight was not perfectly accurate by modern standards. The full mechanics of tornado formation are considerably more complex, but the directional truth of his thinking is stunning given that he had nothing more than his own eyes, his horse, and his formidable intellect. He also made one of the earliest observations about the direction of a tornado's spin. Noting that the whirlwinds he observed seemed to spin in a particular direction relative to their direction of travel, a question that would occupy meteorologists for the next 2 centuries. Franklin's letters about tornadoes and whirlwinds were read widely in the scientific community of his day, both in America and in Europe. They represent one of the first serious attempts to place these phenomena within a framework of natural philosophy, what we would call physics today, rather than theology or folklore. He was not alone in this effort. Across the Atlantic, European naturalists and early scientists were making their own observations and records. In 1760, the German polymath Johann Heinrich Lambert published some of the earliest quantitative observations of wind patterns, including spiral motions associated with storm systems. In Britain, naturalists associated with the newly formed Royal Society were collecting accounts of tornado-like events and attempting to organize them into coherent categories. This was the Age of Enlightenment, that extraordinary intellectual flowering of the 17th and 18th centuries when human beings, across the Western world, began systematically applying reason and observation to the natural world. Everything was being questioned, categorized, measured, and explained. The lightning was no longer God's fury, it was electricity. The rainbow was no longer a divine covenant, it was the refraction of light through water droplets. The tornado was no longer a divine punishment, it was something. Something natural. Something that could, in principle, be understood. The question was, how? And the answer would take another 100 years to begin to emerge. Between 1887 and 1950, those long, forecasting forbidden decades, tornadoes continued to tear across the American landscape with their complete indifference to human policy. And some of them were cataclysmic. Let me take you through a few of these historical events. Not as statistics, not as numbers, though the numbers are staggering, but as stories. As chapters in the long, complicated relationship between human civilization and the spinning sky. Close your eyes for a moment and go there with me. It is a Wednesday afternoon in early spring. In the small towns of southern Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana, people are going about their lives in the ordinary way of Wednesday afternoons in small towns. Farmers are checking on livestock. School children are sitting in classrooms, half listening to teachers, half watching the late winter sunshine through the windows. Women are washing dishes, hanging laundry, preparing dinner. Men are working in mines, in fields, in small shops along main streets. The sky begins to change. A darkness builds to the southwest. Not the ordinary darkness of a coming rainstorm, but something different, something thicker, more absolute. The air becomes heavy and still. The temperature drops with sudden, startling speed. And then, the tri-state tornado. What happened over the next 3.5 hours is, by most measures, the deadliest single tornado in recorded American history. The storm was enormous, by modern estimates, likely between 3/4 of a mile and a full mile wide in some sections. It moved with extraordinary speed, averaging 62 miles per hour over its nearly 220-mile path, and reaching speeds estimated at over 70 miles per hour at times. This made it the fastest-moving major tornado on record. It crossed the Mississippi River, something that was widely believed to be impossible at the time, that a tornado could not survive crossing a major body of water. The tri-state tornado did not get that message. It tore through the town of Gorham, Illinois, population 500, a coal mining community. It left almost nothing standing. Survivors described the sky turning completely black, a roaring like 100 freight trains, and then an instant in which everything around them simply ceased to exist. It struck Murfreesboro, Illinois, a city of 11,000 people. It destroyed nearly half of the city. It killed 234 people in Murfreesboro alone, the highest death toll for a single community from a single tornado in American history. It moved on to DeSoto, Illinois. In DeSoto, the tornado destroyed the elementary school during school hours. 33 children and 2 teachers were killed. Read that again. 33 children. It continued northeast. It struck Parrish, Illinois. Crossville, Illinois. Griffin, Indiana. And finally, after traveling more than 219 miles from its starting point in Missouri, a distance greater than the length of Connecticut, it lifted. The total death toll, at least 695 people. Possibly more. Some estimates place it closer to 750, with many deaths in isolated rural areas never fully recorded. Nearly 2,000 people were injured. More than 15,000 homes were destroyed. And remember, there had been no forecast. There could be no forecast, by law. There had been no warning. There was no system, no siren, no radio broadcast telling people to take cover. Most of the people who died that day had no more warning than the sudden darkening of the sky and the rising roar that came too fast to outrun. I want to rest here for a moment. Because I think it is important, in a story like this, to resist the temptation to move too quickly through the suffering. To pause and acknowledge that behind every number, there is a life. A specific, irreplaceable life. A child who loved a particular color. A farmer who had a name for every one of his horses. A woman who made biscuits every Sunday morning and whose family will taste those biscuits in memory for decades after she is gone. The tri-state tornado was not a statistic. It was hundreds of individual human stories, interrupted. Cut short. Changed forever. And if we carry anything from this moment in our story tonight, let it be that. Let it be the weight of those lives. And let that weight make us grateful, genuinely, deeply grateful. For every advancement in tornado science, every early warning system, every forecaster who dedicated their career to giving people those precious extra minutes that can mean the difference between life and death. The tri-state tornado is the most dramatic, but it was not alone in the historical record. In 1840, what is known as the Natchez tornado struck the Mississippi city of Natchez on May 7, killing somewhere between 317 and 500 people. The second deadliest tornado in American history. It struck with no warning along the Mississippi River, destroying dozens of flatboats and killing many of the poor riverboat workers who had no shelter to retreat to. In 1884, a tornado outbreak struck North Carolina and South Carolina, killing approximately 80 people in a series of storms. This outbreak is notable for occurring in the southeast, a region we sometimes overlook in tornado discussions but which experiences what meteorologists call a second tornado season in the autumn and winter months. In 1896, the Great St. Louis tornado killed 255 people and injured more than 1,000, becoming one of the most destructive storms to ever strike a major American city. The damage was estimated at $10 million, an almost incomprehensible sum in 1896 dollars. And in 1936, just 9 years before the prohibition on tornado forecasting would finally be lifted, a 2-day outbreak of tornadoes struck Mississippi and Georgia. The Tupelo tornado of April 5 killed 216 people, making it one of the deadliest single tornadoes in history. The following day, a tornado struck Gainesville, Georgia, killing 203 more. April 5 and 6, 1936. 2 days. More than 400 people dead. And still, no official tornado warning could be issued. The history of tornado science is, in part, a history of grief. Of accumulated, preventable grief. And understanding that, feeling that, is part of why the scientists who finally broke through and built the modern warning system deserve to be remembered with the deepest respect. The year is 1948. The location, Tinker Air Force Base, near Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. 2 Air Force meteorologists, Captain Ernest Fawbush and Major Robert Miller, are about to do something they were explicitly not supposed to do. They are going to predict a tornado. The story of how this came to happen is worth telling in some detail, because it is a perfect example of how science often advances, not through the grand gestures of genius, but through the quiet courage of people willing to do what is right against the resistance of institutional inertia. On March 20, 1948, a tornado had struck Tinker Air Force Base without warning, causing significant damage to aircraft and installations and injuring several personnel. It was an embarrassing event for the Air Force, an institution that prided itself on being ahead of developments, being prepared, being in control. A tornado hitting the base without warning was not acceptable. Fawbush and Miller were assigned to figure out if there was any way such an event could have been predicted. They studied the atmospheric data from the days and hours leading up to the March 20 tornado with extraordinary care. They noted the temperature and humidity profiles. They noted the wind patterns at various altitudes. They noted the pressure gradients and the patterns of cloud development. And 5 days later, on March 25, 1948, they saw the same pattern beginning to develop again. They looked at each other. They discussed. They debated. This was, they were very aware, a career-ending decision if they were wrong. Predicting tornadoes was not just scientifically uncertain, it was officially prohibited. Going to their commanding officer and saying, "We think a tornado is going to hit the base today," was an act of considerable professional courage. They did it anyway. They briefed General Fred Borum, the base commander. The general listened carefully. He ordered precautionary measures. Aircraft secured, personnel sheltered, operations modified. At 6 p.m. that evening, a tornado touched down at Tinker Air Force Base. It caused damage. But it caused far less damage than the March 20th storm, because people and aircraft had been protected. The precautionary measures had worked. The first tornado forecast in over 60 years had just been proven correct. The story spread quickly through the meteorological community. The Air Force, far from punishing Fawbush and Miller, recognized what they had accomplished and encouraged further research. Other meteorologists began to come forward, sharing observations and data they had been collecting quietly for years, unable to act on them publicly. The prohibition on tornado forecasting in public weather bulletins was lifted in 1950. 2 years after Fawbush and Miller's historic forecast, the United States Weather Bureau issued its first public tornado forecast. And the modern era of tornado science had begun. In 1952, the Severe Local Storms Unit, known as SELS, and pronounced SEALS, was established within the U.S. Weather Bureau in Washington, D.C. Later it would move to Kansas City, Missouri, and ultimately become the Storm Prediction Center in Norman, Oklahoma, where it operates today. The meteorologists who staffed SELS in those early years were pioneers in the most literal sense. They were working largely without precedent, without established methodology, without the computer models and satellite imagery that their successors would take for granted. They had weather balloons, surface observation networks, and their own accumulated knowledge and intuition. They worked in a large room filled with hand-drawn weather maps, trying to identify the atmospheric setups that would produce severe weather in the coming hours and days. They issued outlooks and watches. Broad-scale guidance telling the public when and where tornado conditions were likely. They were right often enough that the system worked. They were wrong often enough to remind them, humbling, that the atmosphere would always hold mysteries they had not yet unlocked. One of the most significant figures from this era is a man named Robert Miller, yes, the same Robert Miller from Tinker Air Force Base, who spent decades at SELS developing what became known as the sounding-based approach to severe weather forecasting. Miller and his colleagues pioneered the use of atmospheric soundings, measurements of temperature, humidity, and wind at various altitudes taken by weather balloons, to diagnose the potential for tornado formation. The parameters they identified, combinations of instability, moisture, wind shear, and lifting mechanisms, form the foundation of severe weather forecasting to this day. The specific numerical thresholds and indices have been refined by decades of additional research, but the fundamental framework that Miller and his SELS colleagues built in the 1950s and 1960s is still the skeleton upon which modern forecasting hangs. These are not household names. They will never be remembered the way that politicians and generals and entertainers are remembered. But every person who has ever received a tornado warning with enough time to take shelter, every family that has crouched in a bathtub or descended to a basement while a warning siren wailed outside, owes something to the quiet, dedicated work of these early forecasters. Now, dear explorer, let us slow down. Let us sit very quietly for a moment in the middle of this story and turn our attention to the science itself. Because the science of how a tornado forms is one of the most beautiful, most intricate, most satisfying stories in all of atmospheric physics. And I am going to try to tell it to you the way it deserves to be told, not as a textbook recitation, but as a story. The story of air finding its voice. Close your eyes and imagine the central United States on a spring afternoon in May. The sun has been beating down on the land since morning. The soil, recently thawed from winter, soaked with spring rains, is releasing moisture upward into the air. This is called evapotranspiration, and it fills the lower layers of the atmosphere with warm, humid air. Think of it as the land breathing, exhaling moisture upward. Meanwhile, far to the south, over the Gulf of Mexico, vast quantities of warm, moist air are being swept northward by the prevailing winds. This is the low-level jet stream, a ribbon of fast-moving, moisture-laden air flowing northward across the Gulf Coast states and into the interior. It is one of the most important players in our story, and it flows most strongly at night and in the early morning hours. From the northwest and north, meanwhile, cold and dry air from Canada is pushing southward along the surface. This air is dense and heavy, it pushes under the warm, moist Gulf air like a wedge, or forces it to rise. And from the west, descending the slopes of the Rocky Mountains, comes a third player, warm, dry air that has been heated by compression as it descended from altitude. This air is lighter than the cold Canadian air but drier than the Gulf air. It slides between them at mid-levels of the atmosphere, creating what meteorologists call an elevated mixed layer, a layer of warm, dry air above the surface that acts like a lid on a pressure cooker. This lid is crucial. It prevents the surface air from rising too quickly, allowing heat and moisture to build up beneath it. Think of it like building pressure under a pot on a stove. The longer you keep the lid on, the more energy accumulates. When the lid finally breaks, when some trigger mechanism forces the surface air upward hard enough to punch through that elevated layer, the results can be explosive. This is what meteorologists call convective initiation. The moment the lid breaks, the moment the pent-up energy is released. And what happens next is one of the most dramatic events in the natural world. The warm, moist surface air, finally released, rockets upward with tremendous energy. It cools as it rises, and the moisture it carries begins to condense, forming water droplets that coalesce into the towering, billowing cumulonimbus clouds that you have probably seen at some point and recognized instinctively as something different from ordinary clouds. Something alive. Something reaching. These clouds grow with extraordinary speed. A developing thunderstorm can build from a modest cumulus cloud to a towering cumulonimbus 20,000, 30,000, even 50,000 feet tall in less than an hour. But a tornado doesn't come from just any thunderstorm. It comes from a very special kind of thunderstorm called a supercell. The supercell is nature's most organized, most powerful, most durable storm engine. And what makes it different from ordinary thunderstorms comes back to that third ingredient we haven't fully discussed yet, wind shear. Wind shear is the change in wind speed and/or direction with altitude. On a normal calm day, the wind near the surface might be blowing gently from the south, and the wind higher up might be blowing from a similar direction at a similar speed. There isn't much shear. But in the environment where supercells form, the wind shear can be extreme. Near the surface, the wind might be blowing from the south at 20 miles per hour. At 5,000 feet, from the southwest at 40 miles per hour. At 18,000 feet, from the west at 80 miles per hour. At 30,000 feet, from the northwest at 100 miles per hour. This layering of different winds at different altitudes creates what meteorologists call a horizontal vortex, essentially, a horizontal cylinder of spinning air embedded in the atmosphere. Imagine it as a massive rolling pin, lying on its side in the atmosphere, spinning around its horizontal axis. Now here comes the beautiful, almost magical step. When the thunderstorm's powerful updraft, that column of rising air shooting upward at speeds that can exceed 100 miles per hour, encounters this horizontal vortex, it does something extraordinary. It tilts it. The horizontal rolling pin vortex gets caught in the updraft and tilted from horizontal to vertical. Suddenly, instead of spinning around a horizontal axis like a rolling pin, the air is spinning around a vertical axis, like a top, or a whirlpool. This vertically spinning column of air, embedded within the thunderstorm's updraft, is called a mesocyclone. It is typically several miles in diameter, much larger than a tornado, and it rotates at speeds that can be felt and sometimes seen in the rotation of the entire thunderstorm. The supercell thunderstorm, with its mesocyclone, is now spinning. You can often see this rotation in the lower base of the supercell, a feature called the wall cloud, where the cloud base descends below the main cloud base in response to the inflow of moist air into the rotating updraft. And from the wall cloud, on certain days when the conditions are exactly right in ways that meteorologists are still working to fully understand, the tornado descends. Exactly how the mesocyclone spawns a tornado at the surface is still one of the most active areas of research in meteorology. The broad outlines are understood. The precise mechanisms are still being refined. What we know is this: the rotation in the supercell's updraft can be intensified enormously near the surface by a process involving the interaction between the storm's downdraft and the surrounding environment. The rear flank downdraft. A rush of descending air that wraps around the back and southern side of the supercell plays a crucial role. As this downdraft descends and spreads out along the surface, it can create a boundary of horizontal wind shear right at the ground that, under the right conditions, gets stretched vertically into the rotating updraft above. Imagine holding a piece of taffy and pulling it upward from both ends. It gets thinner and longer, and it spins faster. This is the principle of conservation of angular momentum, the same principle that makes a spinning figure skater spin faster when they pull their arms in. As the column of spinning air is stretched vertically, pulled upward into the mesocyclone above and anchored near the ground, it spins faster and faster. The pressure inside the spinning column drops dramatically as the spinning accelerates. The low pressure draws in more air from the sides, which then also begins to spin. The condensation funnel that we recognize as the visible tornado forms as the pressure drops cause the moisture in the air to condense. And then, that funnel touches the ground. And the tornado is born. The anatomy of a tornado. A fully developed tornado is a remarkable structure. Let me describe it for you. At the very center of the tornado is the core, a region of relative calm, very low pressure, and ascending air. Contrary to what many people imagine, the absolute center of a tornado is not the most violent part of it. The most violent winds are found in a narrow band just outside the center, the inner core, where the wind speeds are highest and the inward spiraling air reaches its maximum velocity before being turned upward. Surrounding the inner core is the main vortex. The visible funnel that most people recognize. This is made visible by the condensation of water vapor at the low pressure inside the vortex, and also by the debris that the tornado has lifted from the ground. The debris cloud at the base of many tornadoes is often much wider than the visible funnel above, and it is one of the most important things to understand when assessing tornado danger. The damage path of a tornado is often wider than its visible funnel. Around the main vortex, in larger and more powerful tornadoes, there are often suction vortices, smaller, more intense vortices that orbit around the main circulation like satellites. These suction vortices are responsible for some of the most dramatic damage patterns seen in tornado damage surveys. The areas of extreme damage surrounded by areas of much lesser damage, the stripped foundation surrounded by standing structures, the patterns that seem impossibly random to an observer on the ground. The base of the tornado, where it contacts the ground, is called the ground swirl, a turbulent zone where the inward rushing surface winds collide with the rotating vortex and are turned violently upward. This is where debris is lofted into the vortex. Where whole trees are uprooted, where houses are swept off their foundations, where cars are lifted and carried and set down miles from where they began. The visible funnel extends upward from the ground to the storm base, connecting the surface circulation to the mesocyclone above. This connection is essential. A tornado is not a self-contained phenomenon. It is the visible expression of a connection between the ground and the parent thunderstorm above, a bridge between the earth and the sky. And when that bridge is finally broken, when the mesocyclone weakens, or the rear flank downdraft cuts off the storm's supply of moist air, or the atmospheric conditions that sustain the storm begin to change, the tornado dissipates. Often it becomes thin and rope-like first, contorting into extraordinary shapes as it weakens, before finally breaking apart and disappearing, leaving only its damaged path as evidence that it was ever there. Hashtag the scale of destruction, the Fujita and enhanced Fujita scales. No discussion of tornadoes is complete without the Fujita scale, and more particularly, the man who created it, Dr. Tetsuya Theodore Fujita. Dar. Fujita was a Japanese-American meteorologist at the University of Chicago who became, over the course of his extraordinary career, the most influential single figure in tornado research of the 20th century. His work was characterized by a combination of rigorous scientific methodology and an almost artistic eye for the patterns of storm damage, an ability to look at the footprint a tornado left on the landscape and read in it the structure of the storm itself. Fujita came to tornado research through an unexpected path. He was born in Japan in 1920 and trained as a physicist. He was living in Japan when the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, and in the aftermath of the war he was assigned to survey the damage from the bombs. As he surveyed the devastation, calculating blast patterns, inferring pressures and wind speeds from the damage, he developed the methodology that he would later apply to the very different, but in some ways structurally parallel, problem of analyzing tornado damage. Coming to the United States in 1953, Fujita joined the faculty of the University of Chicago and began what would become a lifelong study of severe storms. He was an exceptional observer, painstaking, creative, enormously patient with data. He developed techniques for analyzing tornado damage paths that combined aerial photography, ground surveys, and mathematical analysis in ways that had never been done before. In 1971, he published the scale that bears his name. The Fujita scale, or F-scale, classified tornadoes from F0, minimal damage, winds up to 72 miles per hour, to F5, incredible damage, winds estimated at 261 to 318 miles per hour. The scale was based on damage indicators. The types of structures destroyed, the trees debarked, the cars moved, rather than direct measurement, because direct measurement of tornado wind speeds was essentially impossible with the technology of the era. The Fujita scale gave tornado researchers and meteorologists a common language. For the first time, there was a standardized way to describe and compare tornadoes. To say that the tri-state tornado was likely an F5, that a typical spring storm in Kansas might produce F2s and F3s, that the rare but catastrophic events that leveled entire towns and stripped the bark from trees were in a category of their own. The scale was revised and updated in 2007 to the enhanced Fujita scale, the EF scale, which refined the damage indicators and provided more accurate wind speed estimates. Today, when you hear a tornado described as an EF3 or an EF5, you are using the legacy of Dr. Fujita's extraordinary work. Fujita himself was nicknamed Mr. Tornado, a title he wore with characteristic modesty. He died in 1998, but his methods and insights continue to shape tornado research to this day. On a Tuesday in late May, somewhere on the high plains of Kansas, a convoy of vehicles is moving slowly down a county road. They are not lost. They are hunting. In each vehicle, computer screens glow with weather data, real-time radar, atmospheric soundings, surface observations, model forecasts. Radios crackle with communications between vehicle crews. Eyes scan the horizon constantly, searching for the characteristic lowering of the cloud base, the rotation, the darkening of a specific portion of the sky that says, "Here it comes." These are storm chasers. And their story is one of the most fascinating subplots in the larger narrative of tornado science. Storm chasing is a formalized activity, as a scientific endeavor, not just the amateur adventurism it is sometimes portrayed as, grew out of the same fertile period as all the other advances in tornado science, the 1950s and 1960s, when the lifting of the forecasting prohibition and the establishment of SELS created both the need and the permission to take tornado research seriously. But the golden age of scientific storm chasing, and the individual who more than anyone else defined it, arrived in the form of a young meteorology graduate student at the University of Oklahoma in the early 1970s. His name was David Burgess. And the project he was part of, NSSL, the National Severe Storms Laboratory in Norman, Oklahoma, was about to change tornado science forever. The National Severe Storms Laboratory was established in Norman, Oklahoma in 1964, situated in the heart of Tornado Alley with deliberate geographic intent. Its mission was to understand severe storms, and particularly tornadoes, at a level of scientific depth that had never been achieved before. The tool that made this possible, more than any other single technological development, was Doppler radar. Ordinary weather radar can detect the presence and intensity of precipitation. It tells you that it is raining, and approximately how hard. But it cannot tell you how the precipitation is moving, whether the rain is being swept toward the radar or away from it. Doppler radar can. Using the Doppler effect, the same principle that makes a passing ambulance's siren sound higher-pitched as it approaches and lower-pitched as it recedes, Doppler weather radar can measure the velocity of precipitation, and the air carrying it, toward and away from the radar. It can detect rotation in a storm system. It can see, in the swirling pattern of winds detected within a supercell, the signature of a mesocyclone, and even of a tornado, before the tornado is visible to the human eye. This was revolutionary. Genuinely, transformatively revolutionary. In the early 1970s, NSSL meteorologists using their experimental Doppler radar began to detect, for the first time, the rotational signatures of mesocyclones in supercell thunderstorms. And in 1973, during a famous outbreak of tornadoes that struck central Oklahoma on May 24, they detected something even more remarkable, a distinct, very tight rotational signature associated with an actual tornado on the ground. The tornado vortex signature, a distinctive pattern in Doppler radar data showing two adjacent areas of opposite moving winds in very close proximity, had been identified. With this discovery, it became theoretically possible to detect tornadoes. And the rotational storms likely to produce them, before they could be seen visually. Before they were even on the ground. The implications for warning lead time were enormous. But Doppler radar technology needed to be deployed operationally, to be built into a network of radar stations covering the country, before those implications could be fully realized. And that process would take 2 more decades. In the meantime, the scientists at NSSL and their collaborators were doing something else that was equally important: they were going out to meet the storms. In the 1990s, the National Severe Storms Laboratory organized the most ambitious tornado research project ever undertaken, the verification of the origins of rotation in tornadoes experiment, known as Vortex, or simply, in the meteorological community, the project. The idea was straightforward in concept and maddeningly complex in execution: deploy a convoy of instrumented vehicles around an actual tornado, measuring the wind, temperature, pressure, and humidity in and around the storm with unprecedented density and precision. Capture, for the first time, the three-dimensional structure of a tornado and its parent supercell in real time. Vortex ran in the springs of 1994 and 1995, deploying as many as 18 vehicles and dozens of scientists into the storm-prone regions of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas. It produced the most comprehensive tornado data ever collected. It clarified the role of the rear flank downdraft in tornado formation. It provided data that drove a decade of research into the dynamics of tornado genesis. And it produced, perhaps most famously, the first truly successful deployment of an instrument into the path of a tornado. On June 2, 1995, the Vortex team intercepted a tornado near Dimmitt, Texas. Tim Samras, a self-taught engineer and storm chaser of extraordinary skill and dedication, deployed a turtle-shaped probe in the path of the tornado. The probe survived the direct tornado passage and recorded dramatic pressure drops and wind fluctuations that provided the first ground-level measurements taken inside an actual tornado. Tim Samras would go on to become one of the most revered figures in the storm-chasing community, a meticulous scientist, a gifted engineer, a person who combined the courage of a first responder with the precision of a research physicist. He designed increasingly sophisticated probes, intercepted hundreds of storms, and contributed an irreplaceable body of research. He died on May 31, 2013, in the El Reno, Oklahoma tornado, the widest tornado ever recorded in United States history, reaching a peak width of 2.6 miles. He died alongside his son Paul and fellow researcher Carl Jung when the tornado made an unexpected turn and expanded rapidly, catching them in a situation from which there was no escape. The loss of Tim Samras was felt with tremendous depth throughout the meteorological community. His death was a reminder, as if any reminder were needed, that tornadoes, for all that science has learned about them, remain profoundly and terrifyingly powerful. That the courage it takes to place instruments in the path of a tornado is of a different order than the ordinary courage of ordinary days. His work lives on. The data he collected, the engineering approaches he pioneered, the meticulous documentation standards he set, all continue to influence tornado research today. Let us return now to something more hopeful. Something that honors not just the grief of the history, but the triumph of it. The modern tornado warning system in the United States is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most sophisticated and effective early warning systems ever created for any natural hazard in human history. It is not perfect. Tornadoes are too unpredictable, too localized, too fast-moving for any warning system to provide perfect protection. But it is remarkably, breathtakingly better than what existed 50, or 100, or 200 years ago. Let me walk you through how it works. The WSR-88D, America's Eyes. In the early 1990s, the National Weather Service began deploying a nationwide network of Doppler weather radars. The WSR-88D, more commonly known as NEXRAD, Next Generation Radar. By the mid-1990s, this network of approximately 160 radar stations covered virtually the entire contiguous United States with Doppler radar coverage, providing continuous, real-time data on storms anywhere in the country. NEXRAD fundamentally transformed tornado warning in the United States. For the first time, warning meteorologists could see, in real time, the rotation signatures within developing thunderstorms. The mesocyclone signatures, the tornado vortex signatures, with enough lead time to issue warnings before many tornadoes had even touched the ground. The average lead time for tornado warnings before NEXRAD, approximately 2 minutes. The average lead time for tornado warnings after NEXRAD, approximately 13 minutes. 11 minutes. That does not sound like much. But 11 minutes is the difference between a family cowering under a highway overpass and a family safely sheltered in a basement. Between a school full of children caught in classrooms and a school full of children moved to interior hallways. Between surviving and not surviving. The WSR-88D network has been continuously upgraded and improved since its initial deployment. Modern NEXRAD radars operate in what is called dual polarization mode. They transmit and receive radar energy in both horizontal and vertical orientations, which provides far more information about the size, shape, and type of particles in the air. This dual-pole technology can distinguish between rain, hail, and tornado debris. And the tornado debris signature, which shows the distinctive radar return from lofted debris, provides meteorologists with direct, definitive evidence that a tornado is on the ground, even in situations where the storm cannot be visually observed. Storm Prediction Center, the big picture. While local National Weather Service offices issue the actual tornado warnings, the broader picture of severe weather potential is managed from Norman, Oklahoma, by the Storm Prediction Center. The direct institutional descendant of the old SELS unit that Fawbush and Miller helped inspire. SPC meteorologists work around the clock, 365 days a year, monitoring the atmosphere across the contiguous United States. Their primary products are the convective outlooks, daily forecasts, issued multiple times per day, that assess the risk of severe thunderstorms, damaging winds, large hail, and tornadoes for the coming days. A Day 1 outlook from the SPC covering a broad area of Kansas and Oklahoma with an enhanced or high risk of tornadoes on a spring afternoon is the signal that activates preparations across the warning system, that sends local forecast offices to heightened vigilance, that triggers the notification systems that alert television meteorologists, That prompts emergency managers to review their plans and check their communication systems. The SPC also issues tornado watches. Watch boxes covering broad geographic areas, typically 25,000 to 50,000 square miles, valid for several hours, indicating that conditions are favorable for tornado development. A watch does not mean a tornado is occurring or imminent, it means be ready. It means watch the sky, have a plan, know where you will go if a warning is issued. Watches are the advance notice. Warnings are the alarm. The warning process. When a supercell thunderstorm is detected on radar showing strong rotation that suggests tornado formation is possible or occurring, the local National Weather Service meteorologist has seconds to minutes to make a decision. They are looking at a screen filled with data, radar imagery showing the storm structure, information about storm motion and intensity, reports from trained storm spotters on the ground, and the accumulated knowledge of years of training and experience. They issue a tornado warning. The warning is transmitted simultaneously through multiple channels, to television stations, which are required to break into programming immediately, to the emergency alert system, which pushes an alert to all radio and television broadcasts in the warned area, to the wireless emergency alert system, which sends a notification directly to every cell phone in the warned polygon. To the network of outdoor warning sirens, which are activated by local emergency management agencies. The warning includes the warned area, the time it is valid, the source of the warning, radar indicated or confirmed, and the expected path of the storm. And then, in communities across the warned area, the response begins. People take shelter. Schools enact their emergency procedures. Emergency managers open their communications lines. Spotters drive toward the storm, watching and reporting. Storm chasers position themselves for intercept. And in the warned area, people who might have been standing on their porches watching the sky, or driving down a highway with no idea a storm was approaching, now know. They have time to act. Those minutes, those hard-won, science-built, courage-earned minutes, are the legacy of Fawbush and Miller, of Fujita, of Burgess, of Samras, of every meteorologist who devoted their career to understanding the spinning sky.
Records, extremes, and the edges of what is possible. There are tornadoes, and then there are the tornadoes that test the edges of what seems possible in the natural world. Let me tell you about some of them. We spoke briefly of the El Reno, Oklahoma tornado in the context of Tim Samaras' death. But the El Reno tornado deserves its own place in this story, because it is, by one crucial measure, the most extreme tornado ever recorded in United States history. It is the widest. At its peak, the El Reno tornado reached a width of 2.6 miles, nearly 4 kilometers from one edge of its damage path to the other. For comparison, the average tornado in the United States is perhaps a few hundred yards wide. Even major violent tornadoes typically span half a mile to a mile. El Reno was in a category by itself. But the El Reno tornado was notable not just for its size. It was notable for its behavior, specifically, for the way it moved. Tornadoes in the United States move, on average, from the southwest toward the northeast, carried along by the prevailing flow of the atmosphere. Their speed varies, but their direction is broadly predictable. El Reno did not behave predictably. It began moving east-northeast at moderate speed, as expected. Then, in a matter of minutes, it stopped, turned sharply southward, and then resumed moving east-northeast. This kind of sudden, dramatic directional change is known as a cyclic or erratic tornado movement, and it is one of the most dangerous behaviors a tornado can exhibit. It was this erratic movement that caught storm chasers, including Tim Samaras, off guard. The storm appeared to be moving away from their position and then suddenly was moving toward them, expanding rapidly. Several vehicles were swept up. Several people died. The El Reno event led to significant reflection in the storm-chasing community about the limits of positional certainty around large, powerful tornadoes, and drove changes in chase protocols and risk assessment that continue to influence how both scientific and amateur chasers approach extreme events. The deadliest in modern times, Joplin, May 22, 2011. If the tri-state tornado of 1925 represents the worst of what happened before the modern warning system, the Joplin, Missouri tornado of May 22, 2011 represents the worst of what can still happen within the modern warning system. The Joplin tornado was rated EF5, the highest category on the enhanced Fujita scale. Its maximum width was approximately 3/4 of a mile. It struck a city of roughly 50,000 people with a damage path more than 6 miles long through the heart of the urban area. 157 people died. And here is the sobering, humbling, important part of this story: there were warnings. Multiple tornado warnings had been issued. Sirens had been sounding. The National Weather Service had been tracking the storm, issuing urgent updates, communicating the severity of the situation as clearly and forcefully as the tools available allowed. And people still died. Some because they did not hear the warnings. Some because they were in vehicles among the most dangerous places to be in a tornado. Some because they were in the wrong place at the wrong moment regardless of what they did. Some because the tornado was simply too powerful, too wide, too destructive for the structures they sheltered in to survive. The Joplin tornado generated a massive response from the research community. A systematic post-event analysis that examined warning dissemination, public response, shelter survival rates, and building performance. The findings shaped policies, building codes, shelter programs, and warning communication strategies across the country. One of the most striking findings, the fact that sirens had been sounding before Joplin, actually complicated the situation for some residents. In parts of the country where false alarms are common and warnings are frequent, people can become desensitized, can fail to take action on a valid warning because they have taken action on many warnings before and nothing happened. This phenomenon, called warning fatigue or cry wolf syndrome, is one of the most challenging problems in emergency communication, and it remains an active area of research and public education. The fastest, Hallam, Nebraska, May 22, 2004. The widest tornado was El Reno. What about the most intense wind speeds ever measured in a tornado? Here the answer is less certain, because direct measurement of tornado wind speeds is extremely difficult. The highest wind speed ever measured directly inside a tornado was obtained by a portable Doppler radar unit during the Bridge Creekmore, Oklahoma tornado of May 3, 1999, 301 miles per hour, the highest wind speed ever recorded near the Earth's surface. 301 miles per hour. Consider that number for a moment. The highest wind speed ever recorded at the surface of the Earth. Cars travel at highway speed at 65 miles per hour. Commercial aircraft cruise at around 575 miles per hour. The winds in the most violent tornado ever measured were more than 4 times the speed of highway traffic. The Bridge Creekmore tornado of May 3, 1999 was also one of the most destructive tornadoes in Oklahoma history, part of a massive outbreak that saw dozens of tornadoes across the state and caused historic damage to the Oklahoma City metropolitan area. It was the event that, perhaps more than any other, brought home to the American public the reality of what an F5/EF5 tornado could do to a modern city. The longest, the tri-state tornado. We return, as we must, to the tri-state tornado of 1925. In addition to being the deadliest, the tri-state tornado holds the record for the longest continuous tornado track in United States history, 219 miles from its initial touchdown in Ellington, Missouri to its final dissipation near Paoli, Indiana. 219 miles of continuous contact between a tornado and the Earth. For 3.5 hours. Modern meteorologists have debated whether the tri-state tornado was truly a single continuous tornado or a family of tornadoes that formed along the same general track, a phenomenon not uncommon in very long-tracked events. The historical record, based on damage surveys and survivor accounts, suggests a single continuous vortex for most of the track, though the storm was so far ahead of its time in terms of documentation that definitive answers are difficult. Either way, the track length is extraordinary. And the destruction along that track, 695 or more lives, over 11,000 homes destroyed, an estimated 27,000 families left homeless, remains a sobering reminder of what was possible before the modern warning system, and of what remains possible in the most extreme scenarios even with it. Where tornadoes strike around the world. We have spent much of our story in the United States, and for good reason. The United States experiences more tornadoes, and more violent tornadoes, than any other country on Earth. But the tornado is not an exclusively American phenomenon. Tornadoes occur on every inhabited continent. They occur in places you might not expect, and in patterns that reveal the underlying atmospheric physics rather than any special American geography. Tornado Alley, the classic region. The classic tornado alley of the United States encompasses the Great Central Plains. Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota. This region experiences the convergence of Gulf moisture, Canadian cold air, and Rocky Mountain-derived dry air in the most intense and frequent configuration found anywhere on Earth. Texas leads all states in total tornado count, typically recording well over 100 tornadoes per year. Oklahoma, proportional to its size, may have the highest density of tornado occurrences of any state. Kansas. The quintessential tornado state in popular imagination, home of Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, lives up to its reputation with approximately 95 tornadoes per year on average. But in recent decades, meteorologists and statisticians have recognized that the traditional tornado alley designation understates the risk in other regions. Dixie Alley, the Southeast's underappreciated danger. The southeastern United States, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, Arkansas, experiences what researchers now call Dixie Alley, a region where tornadoes may actually pose a higher per capita risk than the classic Central Plains. There are several reasons why southeastern tornadoes are particularly dangerous. First, they occur in a different seasonal pattern. While the classic tornado alley sees its peak activity in spring, April through June, Dixie Alley experiences significant tornado activity in late fall and winter as well, October through March. This second peak catches residents off guard, and it also means that tornadoes frequently occur at night, when visibility is zero, storm spotters cannot operate, and people are asleep. Nocturnal tornadoes are disproportionately deadly. They occur when warning sirens may not be heard inside homes, when the instinctive triggers of darkening sky and strange light that might alert someone during the day are absent, when people are in the deepest and most oblivious sleep. Second, the terrain and vegetation of the southeast differ from the open plains of the central region. Trees and hills block visibility, making it harder to see an approaching tornado. Older, less robust housing stock, including a higher proportion of mobile homes, provides less shelter. Third, and this is perhaps the most sociologically significant point, public awareness and preparedness for tornadoes has historically been lower in the southeast than in the Central Plains. This is changing, but it is changing slowly, and in the meantime the cost is paid in lives. Tornadoes around the world. Beyond North America, tornadoes occur with some frequency in several other regions. Europe experiences significantly more tornadoes than is commonly known. Estimates suggest between 300 and 500 tornadoes per year across the continent, with Great Britain, the Netherlands, Germany, France, and Italy being most frequently affected. European tornadoes are generally weaker than their North American counterparts. F2/EF2 and below make up the vast majority, but they do occasionally produce significant destruction. The most destructive European tornado in recent history struck the Lodz region of Poland in August 2008, killing several people and destroying hundreds of buildings. Bangladesh and India experience some of the world's deadliest tornadoes outside the United States. The geography of Bangladesh. Flat, low-lying, densely populated, creates ideal conditions for tornado development during the pre-monsoon season. The Dhul-Tupper-Salturia tornado of April 1989 killed an estimated 1,300 people, making it one of the deadliest tornadoes in world history. Argentina and southern Brazil are home to the most tornado-active region in the southern hemisphere. The Pampas of Argentina present some structural similarities to the North American Great Plains. Flat terrain, convergence of different air masses, and produce tornadoes with some regularity, including occasional violent events. Australia experiences tornadoes primarily along its northwestern and eastern coasts, often associated with tropical cyclone systems. These are generally weaker than the most violent North American events but can still cause significant damage. The global distribution of tornadoes, when mapped, reveals the underlying atmospheric physics with beautiful clarity. Tornadoes cluster in regions where the specific combination of surface moisture, instability, wind shear, and trigger mechanisms come together with the right frequency and intensity. The central United States is the global champion of this combination, but it is not alone. What it is like to be near a tornado. All of the science, all of the history. They describe tornadoes from the outside. From a distance. From the perspective of the observer, the researcher, the forecaster. But what is it actually like to be near a tornado? Let me try to describe it, drawing on the accounts of hundreds of survivors and observers and chasers, not as a sensationalized account, but as a considered, careful attempt to convey what the experience is. Because there is something important in understanding this. Something that connects the science to the human experience in a way that pure meteorological description cannot. Long before the tornado itself appears, the atmosphere gives signs. The air changes. People describe a heaviness, a strange pressure, a quality of the light that is difficult to name. Often described as a greenish or yellowish tint, caused by the combination of the cloud's shadow and the reflection of late afternoon sunlight off the enormous amount of hail sometimes carried in supercell thunderstorms. The wind picks up. Then, unsettlingly, may die completely. This calm before the tornado, the eerie calm that appears in so many survivor accounts, is caused by the inflow of air into the base of the storm, which can temporarily overwhelm the surface wind in a way that creates near total stillness. Animals respond before humans often do. Dogs bark or whimper and seek shelter. Birds disappear. Cattle move restlessly. Horses rear and pull. The insects go silent. There is a biological sensitivity to atmospheric change that human beings, with our increasingly indoor and insulated lives, have largely lost, but that other creatures retain. The sky darkens. Not uniformly, but selectively. Certain portions of the horizon, typically to the southwest and the Central Plains, take on the bruised quality that experienced plains residents recognize and fear. The clouds above are moving with visible, rapid swirling, the inflow into the supercell's mesocyclone visible even at cloud level. And then, sometimes, the hail begins. First small, pattering like gravel on rooftops. Then larger, sudden, punishing. Baseball-sized hail has been recorded in supercells, frozen spheres of ice the size of your fist, falling at terminal velocity, destructive and entirely unpredictable. The hail can be followed almost immediately by the tornado. The two are often separated by only minutes, because both hail and tornado formation are associated with the same intense updraft within the supercell. Every person who has been near a tornado and survived to describe it mentions the sound. It is one of the most consistent details in thousands of survivor accounts across more than a century. And it is one of the most difficult details to convey. The most common description, a freight train. Not the sound of a distant train, but of a freight train passing close, the roar and rumble and felt vibration of something massive moving at speed in your immediate vicinity. But many survivors push past that metaphor because it isn't quite right. Some describe it as more like a waterfall, a continuous, overwhelming, all-encompassing roar of water. Some describe it as a jet engine. Some describe it as a combination of all these things plus something else, a deep, bone-felt vibration that is less heard than felt. What creates the sound is the combined roar of thousands of tons of air moving at extreme speed, the sounds of debris in the vortex, trees snapping, structures being demolished, cars being lifted. And the resonance of the vortex structure itself. Survivors frequently describe the sound as having a quality of presence. Not just volume. Presence. As if the sound itself were a living thing. Those who have seen tornadoes up close describe a range of appearances depending on the tornado's structure, the amount of debris it is carrying, the lighting conditions, and the storm's overall characteristics. A tornado in open country with little debris, seen in good lighting conditions, can appear almost gracefully beautiful, a smooth, gray-white funnel hanging from the storm's dark base, rotating visibly, sometimes slowly and majestically, sometimes with terrifying speed. A tornado that has been on the ground for some time in populated or wooded areas is often nearly invisible within the debris cloud it has accumulated. A churning, dark mass of soil and vegetation and building materials, the funnel itself hidden within the larger envelope of destruction. Storm chasers frequently describe the experience of watching a large tornado as profoundly disorienting in scale. The human visual system is calibrated for a world of human-sized objects. A tornado a mile wide, extending from the ground to the storm base 30,000 feet above, simply does not fit the visual processing system's expectations. People report feeling that they cannot quite grasp the scale of what they are seeing, that the mind keeps trying to impose smaller, more familiar dimensions on something that fundamentally exceeds them. Those who survive a tornado's direct passage describe the aftermath in terms that are simultaneously mundane and surreal. The storm is gone often in seconds. The roaring ceases. The air becomes still, or nearly still. The sky above, which was churning in black, may reveal itself, minutes after the tornado passes, to be clearing blue sky emerging behind the departing storm. And then the silence, and what the silence reveals. The world looks different. Trees that were standing are gone, or stripped to bare trunks, or broken at mid-height. Buildings that were there are not there. Things that should be heavy are where they should not be. Things that are fragile are intact in places where everything substantial has been destroyed. The arbitrary quality of tornado destruction is one of its most frequently noted characteristics. A house swept entirely from its foundation with no trace remaining, while the house next door stands with its windows intact. A china cabinet, contents unbroken, sitting in an open field a quarter-mile from where the house it occupied once stood. A Bible open to a specific page, pages unmarked, found miles from its origin. These are not miracles, though survivors sometimes describe them in those terms. They are the natural expression of the chaotic turbulence within a tornado, the fact that the vortex contains within it regions of relatively ordered flow and regions of violent chaos, and that the boundary between these regions can be narrow enough that two objects a few feet apart can experience radically different fates. But I understand why people reach for the word miracle. When you are standing in the wreckage of your home, looking at the object that survived while everything around it was destroyed, the human impulse toward meaning is overwhelming. The impulse to find in the chaos some shred of intention, some evidence of care. We are meaning-making creatures. We always have been. From the ancient indigenous person watching the whirlwind to the modern tornado survivor standing in the rubble of their life, the impulse is the same. The question is the same. What does this mean? And perhaps the most honest answer, and the most comforting answer I know, is this: it means the world is powerful and complex beyond our full understanding, and we are still here, still asking the question, still rebuilding, still reaching toward what we cannot fully grasp.
Let us talk, for a little while, about the people. Not the tornadoes. The people. The people who live in tornado-prone regions and who, generation after generation, choose to stay. Who build houses on the same plains that the tornadoes cross. Who plant gardens in the springs that also bring the storms. Who raise children under skies that, on certain afternoons in certain seasons, can turn terrifyingly violent with very little warning. Why do they stay? I have thought about this question for a long time, and I find that the honest answer is more interesting than the simple one. The simple one is economics, family, inertia. Many people stay where they were born because moving is expensive and difficult. Many stay because their family is there. Many stay because it is home, and home has a gravity that is hard to explain to people who haven't felt it. All of that is true. But it is not the whole truth. The whole truth includes something harder to articulate, that living with risk, genuine, serious, non-theoretical risk, changes you. It changes your relationship with the present moment. It changes your relationship with your community. It changes your sense of what matters and what doesn't. People who live in tornado country talk about their communities with a kind of fierceness and intimacy that is partly a product of that shared risk. When a tornado strikes, the community response is immediate, personal, and profound. Neighbors who barely know each other in ordinary times show up at each other's doors with chainsaws and food and a willingness to work for days without pay to help clear the rubble and rebuild what was lost. This is not unique to tornado country. Communities in hurricane zones, earthquake zones, flood plains, any place where natural disaster is a real and recurring presence, often develop similar qualities. A certain seriousness. A certain groundedness. A certain willingness to take care of each other that urban populations, insulated by distance and individualism, sometimes find puzzling or even moving. There is also, for many residents of tornado-prone regions, a relationship with the storms themselves that is more complicated than simple fear. There is awe. There is a kind of reluctant respect. There is even, in certain people, particularly those who grow up watching tornadoes from safe distances, who learn from an early age the difference between a dangerous position and a safe one, who develop the weather literacy that plains communities pass from generation to generation like any other form of essential knowledge, something that approaches love. Not for the destruction. Never for the destruction. But for the power. For the beauty. For the reminder that the world is not tame. That the sky is not just backdrop. That the atmosphere is a living, dynamic, endlessly complex system that occasionally reasserts itself in the most dramatic possible terms. I have spoken with people from Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas who describe watching a supercell thunderstorm on a spring evening. The enormous, architecturally beautiful storm structure, the anvil-shaped top spreading hundreds of miles to the east, the mammothous clouds hanging beneath like clusters of round stones, the setting sun turning the whole edifice gold and amber, with a reverence that I recognize from descriptions of the most beautiful art, the most transcendent music, the most profound religious experiences. The atmosphere is doing something there that nothing human has ever matched. Building something more complex and more powerful than anything our engineering has ever achieved, from nothing more than water vapor and temperature differentials and the physics of a rotating planet. It is, in the deepest and most honest sense, magnificent. And the people of Tornado Alley, who live with it season after season, year after year, generation after generation, they know this in a way that few people elsewhere in the world do. Modern research and the mysteries that remain. For all that we know about tornadoes, and we know a great deal more than the scientists of 50 years ago, 1,000 times more than the scientists of 100 years ago, there remains a profound and humbling amount that we do not know. The fundamental question, why do some supercell thunderstorms produce tornadoes and others do not, remains only partially answered. We know the large-scale ingredients. We know that you need instability, moisture, wind shear, and a lifting mechanism. We know that supercells are the most efficient tornado factories in the atmosphere. We know the radar signatures that suggest tornadic potential. But we cannot reliably predict, looking at an individual supercell, whether it will produce a tornado. Two supercells with nearly identical large-scale environmental profiles will behave differently. One will produce a violent long-track tornado. The other will be a heavy rain and hail event with no tornado at all. Why? The answer seems to lie in the details of the storm's internal dynamics, the precise temperature and moisture structure of the air near the surface, the exact configuration of the rear flank downdraft, subtle variations in the boundary layer that are too small-scale to be resolved by the current observation network. This is what drives the current generation of tornado researchers. Projects like Vortex 2. The second Vortex campaign, which ran in 2009 and 2010 with an even larger armada of instruments and vehicles than the original, are aimed specifically at this problem. Smaller scale, more targeted than the original Vortex, Vortex 2 deployed mobile Doppler radars, mobile mesonettes, vehicles with meteorological instruments, unmanned aerial vehicles, and advanced computer modeling in an effort to capture the subtle near-storm processes that distinguish tornadic from non-tornadic supercells. The data from Vortex 2 is still being analyzed, still generating publications, still pushing the frontiers of understanding. Meanwhile, the next generation of observation technology is already being developed and tested. Phased array radar systems, which can scan the atmosphere far more rapidly than the current NEXRAD radars, hold the promise of capturing the three-dimensional structure of rapidly evolving tornado-producing storms at unprecedented temporal resolution. Mobile radars mounted on trucks can be driven to within a few kilometers of an active tornado, providing data at ranges and resolutions that fixed-site radars cannot achieve. Unmanned aerial systems, drones, are being developed and tested for deployment into and around severe storm environments, gathering atmospheric measurements in the high-risk regions between the ground and the cloud base where human-crewed aircraft cannot safely operate. Computer modeling of supercell thunderstorms has advanced to the point where modern simulations can reproduce, with remarkable fidelity, the internal dynamics of tornadic storms, including the formation, intensification, and dissipation of tornado-like vortices within simulated supercells. These simulations, running on the most powerful supercomputers available, are revealing the sensitivity of tornado formation to small-scale environmental variations in ways that observational data alone cannot resolve. The trajectory of this research, if maintained, points toward a future in which tornado warnings are more precise, more reliable, more useful. A future in which the warning lead time might be extended from the current average of 13 minutes to 20 or 30 minutes. A future in which false alarms might be reduced, making the public more willing to take action on the warnings that are issued. A future in which the gap between what meteorologists know and what the public understands is smaller and more navigable. This is not a guaranteed future. It requires sustained investment in research, in operational meteorology, in public education, and in the infrastructure of observation and communication that makes the warning system work. But it is an achievable future. And the people working toward it, in university atmospheric science departments, in government laboratories, in the forecasting offices of the National Weather Service, in the vehicles chasing supercells across the plains on spring afternoons, are doing work that deserves to be remembered and honored. When the sky goes to war with itself. We have talked about individual tornadoes. But some of the most significant events in tornado history are not single storms but outbreaks, episodes when atmospheric conditions are so favorable for severe weather that dozens or even hundreds of tornadoes form over a period of hours or days across a broad region. Tornado outbreaks represent the atmosphere at its most extreme, a system-wide expression of the instabilities we have described, playing out across a continental scale. The super outbreak of April 3 to 4, 1974. Before 2011, the gold standard of tornado outbreaks was the super outbreak of April 3 to 4, 1974. In a 16-hour period from mid-afternoon on April 3 to the morning of April 4, 148 confirmed tornadoes struck 13 states across the central and eastern United States, from Alabama and Mississippi northeastward through Kentucky and Ohio and Indiana. 148 tornadoes in 16 hours. The most violent single tornado of the outbreak struck the city of Xenia, Ohio, a community of roughly 25,000 people, killing 34 people and destroying more than a third of the city. The Xenia tornado was rated F5, with damage that included houses swept completely off their foundations and heavy vehicles thrown hundreds of yards. The outbreak also produced tornadoes in Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, and Virginia.